year. But, Mr. Speaker, as parliamentary representative for the Wesley constituency, I am once again pleased with the measures and plans and the progress, Mr. Speaker, for the international airport. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Prime Minister informed this Honorable House that China Railway Engineering Group, CR5, has been selected to construct the international airport. Mr. Speaker, what this means is during this fiscal year, we will see a lot more activity in the Wesley constituency. Mr. Speaker, my people of Wesley, Woodford Hill, and Palm Tree, we stand to benefit directly from this large investment. Mr. Speaker, over $24 million have already been paid to homeowners. Mr. Speaker, the Joe Burton development is one of the most beautiful housing development in this country at this time. Mr. Speaker, we have seen the evidence of increased economic activity in the constituency of Wesley. Our shops, our bars, our restaurants, they are all making money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have already seen franchised businesses leaving Roseau and coming to the Wesley constituency, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last few months, I have received calls from 2 large supermarket owners, Mr. Speaker, and they are looking for land in excess of 10 acres in the Wesley constituency to put down businesses, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I present to you tonight, there's a shortage of houses to rent in the Wesley constituency. Mr. Speaker, existing homeowners are expanding to incorporate bed and breakfast in their residence, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, several young men from my constituency are currently employed on the housing program, Mr. Speaker. Even at the lab, Mr. Speaker, we have young men from the Wesley constituency learning at the lab at the Wesley. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. But it's no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that we have already begun to see the improvements in the community and the infrastructure because of this international airport, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for this generation and generations to come, the Wesley constituency, Mr. Speaker, and Dominica will benefit from this international airport. Mr. Speaker, Dynamic Dominica is taking shape in the Wesley constituency. Mr. Speaker, I have done so in the past, Mr. Speaker, and I cannot do so enough. I would like to express my profound gratitude to the people of Wesley, Woodford Hill, and Palm Tree for the level of cooperation that we have seen in the construction of this international airport, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to inform this Honorable House that homeowners who have to be relocated have already started receiving their keys to move in at Joe Burton. Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my thanks to the Honorable Prime Minister, who continues to lead with a steady, fair hand and a level head, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to express my gratitude to the Honorable Prime Minister for entrusting me to lead the agriculture and fisheries sector, Mr. Speaker, in these challenging times. Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my thanks also to my colleagues who have supported us during this financial year. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to thank the Minister of Planning, Dr. Henderson, the Cabinet Secretary, Ms. Prevost, the Financial Secretary, Ms. Edwards, the PS in the Office of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Henderson, and all the public officers who contributed to this budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand here today representing over 4,000 farmers and over 500 fisher folk on this island, Mr. Speaker, from the largest to the smallest. Mr. Speaker, these are our food heroes, Mr. Speaker, and I take my responsibility very seriously. Mr. Speaker, it is for that reason, during the last fiscal year, I have charged the ministry to get out of the office. We have visited farms. We have drove the feeder roads. We have visited the boathouses. We have visited the landing site, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have also engaged a number of supermarkets, the hucksters, the boat captains, and a host of other stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we believe our farmers and fisher folk deserve to be honored and rewarded. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I would like to pause to congratulate Mr. D.Les Warrington of Calibishi, Mr. Speaker, who was awarded in October 2021 the CARICOM Farmer of the Year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the same year, the ministry also rewarded 10 deserving farmers and fisher folk across the island. Mr. Speaker, this award ceremony will continue as an annual event and will pursue tangible awards, Mr. Speaker, for our farmers and fisher folk. Mr. Speaker, this Labour Party-led administration has invested hundreds of millions in the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past 5 years following Hurricane Maria, we have invested over $145 million, Mr. Speaker, in the agriculture sector. Mr. Speaker, $145 million. This money was used in strengthening, empowering, and building back a stronger sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last fiscal year, no stone has been left unturned. Mr. Speaker, the investment this Labour Party administration has made in the sector is bearing fruit. Mr. Speaker, I will demonstrate that this Labour Party government is transforming the agriculture and fishery sector as we know it. Mr. Speaker, we are creating opportunities for employment for our young people. We are creating employment opportunities where they could create generational wealth in the agriculture sector. Mr. Speaker, we are building the agriculture and fisheries sector to be resilient, innovative, inclusive, sustainable, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, internationally competitive. Mr. Speaker, I must, however, speak of some of the accomplishments we had in the last fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, despite all the challenges that we face, COVID-19, rising oil prices, logistic challenges, Mr. Speaker, the agriculture sector here in Dominica is on an upward trajectory. Mr. Speaker, the fact is there is a much wider variety of fruits available than we had 20 or 25 years ago here in the Commonwealth of Dominica, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is undeniable that our produce are of the highest quality, and there is an increasing demand for our produce. Mr. Speaker, in the last fiscal year, we harvested, over 50 million pounds of produce. Mr. Speaker, this is a deliberate attempt and targeted efforts by the ministry and the government, Mr. Speaker, and we have expanded the output in selected crops, some of which include yams, dasheen, turmeric, ginger, passion fruit, and white potatoes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last fiscal year, we had seen over 200 white potato farmers planted the white potato, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we continue to see the Ministry of Agriculture providing support to these farmers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have provided agrochemicals, we have provided fertilizer, and we have provided tilling services to a number of farmers in this particular sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is the aim of the ministry, along with the Ministry of Trade, to approach 2 planting seasons in this fiscal year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we speak of accomplishments, Mr. Speaker, I need to make note of our partnership with the Chinese Technical Mission, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the last fiscal year, we distributed, Mr. Speaker, at concessionary prices, over 300,000 high-quality seedlings, over 5,000 flower seedlings, Mr. Speaker, over 6,000 fruit trees. Mr. Speaker, we distributed just under 1,000 dragon fruit seedlings across Dominica. Mr. Speaker, dragon fruit has become increasingly popular because of the health benefits, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, locally, one fruit goes for 30 EC dollars. Mr. Speaker, in our neighboring islands, one fruit goes for 40 EC dollars a pound, Mr. Speaker. And this is the kind of production that we are going into in the fiscal year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Chinese Technical Mission did not only provide high-quality seedlings, Mr. Speaker. They provided training opportunities for over 336 Dominicans, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the People's Republic of China, Dr. Sun, and his team for their efforts, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, some of us do not like to hear about Hurricane Maria, Mr. Speaker. Hurricane Maria was a mere 5 years ago. Mr. Speaker, we have a set of persons here in this honorable house who tend to glorify their miserable performance between 1995 and 2000. Mr. Speaker, they want to tell Dominicans that they are the alternative. Mr. Speaker, if there is anything in this world that is as destructive as Hurricane Maria, it is the UWP, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, UWP brought us to ground zero. Mr. Speaker, Maria brought us to ground zero. Mr. Speaker, we needed 10 years. Mr. Speaker, maybe 22, because we are still recovering from the UWP, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, that's right.
Mr. Speaker, again, I would like to express my thanks to the Honorable Prime Minister for his intervention in the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through the World Bank program, which is part loan, part grant, Mr. Speaker, we have provided support to over 4,300 farmers, including vouchers for fertilizer, agrochemicals, tools, and equipment. Mr. Speaker, under the livestock component, Mr. Speaker, we have approved 190 farmers which would see improvements to their livestock holding, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have distributed engines in excess of $1.7 million. And Mr. Speaker, we are in the process of building 53 boats for our fisher folk, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, under the infrastructure component, Mr. Speaker, we will see improvements to a number of our regional offices, Mr. Speaker. The first office to be repaired under this program, Mr. Speaker, is the Northeast Regional Office at Londonderry. This office serves farmers from Concord to Anzime, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the ministry has been working, and the evidence is clear. Mr. Speaker, in the whole thrust to digitize the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker, we have been paying attention to our data. Mr. Speaker, in the last fiscal year, we have exported over 30 million pounds, Mr. Speaker, to our neighboring islands in the north. Mr. Speaker, this data does not include the airports and ferry services, Mr. Speaker. This is just coming from the Longhouse, Mr. Speaker, at Portsmouth. Mr. Speaker, we have seen a number of persons, Mr. Speaker, lawyers, doctors, accountants, moving into farming, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is what you call money meeting money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these professionals went into agriculture knowing well and they are confident that the economic climate that exists for them, Mr. Speaker. They are confident, Mr. Speaker, that there are markets for their produce. Mr. Speaker, that is what you call transforming the sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past, farming and agriculture used to be something for the poor, the uneducated, the man from the country, not the affluent, Mr. Speaker. But this is changing. Mr. Speaker, no longer you hear farmers talking about, I'm going to rear a few birds or I'm going to plant a piece of land, Mr. Speaker. They are saying they are going to invest in the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is how the measures and progress can grow. Mr. Speaker, that is how these measures are growing the economy and the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the notable achievements for us in the ministry, Mr. Speaker, is the training of 8 drone pilots, 8 extension officers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we have seen the benefits of this intervention, Mr. Speaker. These drones will be able to capture data, crop size, crop quantity, and elevation profiles, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this new technology will improve the data collection at the ministry, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member for Salisbury is disturbing me, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I am speaking about digitization of the economy, Mr. Speaker. I am speaking about ICT, information technology, Mr. Speaker, and he sits on his degree at his home on Facebook. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, my brother, you don't win elections on Facebook, you know. Additionally, Mr. Speaker,
you cannot see my brother, you see.
the member for Salisbury, you don't
Yes.
win elections on Facebook, my brother. Mr. Speaker, with the support of the UNDP, Mr. Speaker, we saw 45 extension officers receiving personal equipment, Mr. Speaker, boots, raincoats, and gloves, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the government, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the UNDP and the government of Japan for their support. Mr. Speaker, On our restoration project, Mr. Speaker, we have invested over $250,000 in training of our extension officers with the University of the West Indies. Mr. Speaker, while I'm on extension, Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Felix Leslie, Mr. Speaker. He will be retiring this year after 39 years of service, Mr. Speaker. I thank him for his prayers and his advice during my time at the ministry, Mr. Speaker. I would also like to express my thanks to Mr. Revelia Centros, an extension officer in the Northeast region, Mr. Speaker, who is also retiring this year. Mr. Speaker, all these investments, what do they mean, Mr. Speaker, for the agriculture sector and Dominica? Mr. Speaker, in my travels during the last fiscal year, I came across a farmer, Mr. Speaker, and with much excitement, he's telling me about his birthday dinner at the Kempinski. Mr. Speaker, on the menu at Kempinski, Mr. Speaker, there were brandy farm prawns, Mr. Speaker, and Margot chicken breast. Mr. Speaker, when we said that we were building hotels and we were building the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker, this is what we were speaking of, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, outside of the local food which he enjoyed, Mr. Speaker, he was appreciative, like every Dominican, Mr. Speaker, to be at a five-star resort in his own country. Mr. Speaker, this is the dynamic Dominica that this Labour Party is building. A Dominica where our young people can invest in sustainable and profitable businesses, Mr. Speaker, for a ready local market. Mr. Speaker, during the last fiscal year, we did extensive work on our hatchery at Belfast, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend and thank the work of a young Kalinago, Mr. Dorian Sanford, indeed, and the Chief Fisheries Officer, Mr. Julian Defoe, for their contribution and work in the aquaculture sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to express my gratitude to the FAO, who are working with the ministry to improve the CMOS industry to boost our commercial CMOS here on the island, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we know and have demonstrated that agriculture is at the heart of the survival of our people. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia war has caused unimaginable disruption in our food chain and an ever-increasing cost of production. Mr. Speaker, Dominica has done nothing to cause this war, but we are suffering because of it. These global events have rearranged our lives, Mr. Speaker, and the world. But, Mr. Speaker, we know if there is one thing that remains true, it is that the countries who survive in hard times are those who can feed themselves. The countries who thrive are those who can turn any crisis into an opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the countries who will continue to grow are those countries who value and appreciate the agriculture and fisheries sector. The Honorable Prime Minister has charged the ministry, the cabinet, and the whole nation that we should increase the contribution of agriculture to 700 million, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have hit the ground running, Mr. Speaker, and plans are in place to reach this target. Mr. Speaker, This budget is designed to respond to the current world challenges, creating fresh initiatives and a cushion for our economy. This 2022 budget will not only address unemployment created by COVID-19, the incentives will create opportunities and innovation in the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker. As the Honorable House heard during this year, Mr. Speaker, the government will invest $1 million in the provision of greenhouses, cover material, irrigation system, and other necessities to ensure that fresh fruits and vegetables will be available all year round. Mr. Speaker, apart from this $1 million, as I just mentioned, another $1 million will be placed in the Young Professionals Initiative. Mr. Speaker, the youth must be part of this. They must be part of this journey, Mr. Speaker, and they must be at the forefront of this revolution in the agriculture sector. Mr. Speaker, I am confident that this investment will multiply, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank one of the extension officers, Mr. Addison Trotter, for his work, Mr. Speaker, because data has become an important part of this ministry and this government moving forward. Mr. Speaker, just speaking to one supermarket, for the last fiscal year, they imported over 60,000 pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables, some of which include watermelon, bell peppers, broccoli, cauliflower, cantaloupe, and dragon fruit, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is disturbing the amount of fresh produce that we are importing. The statistics show, Mr. Speaker, that we are importing over $7 million of fresh fruits and vegetables on an annual basis, Mr. Speaker. And these measures in this budget, Mr. Speaker, will create an opportunity for the young people in this country to create millions for themselves, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a quantum leap in this agriculture industry, Mr. Speaker, is an investment of over $13 million in the tissue culture facility at 1 Mile. Mr. Speaker, this lab will be a comprehensive facility that integrates research, teaching, and production of high-quality seedlings, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the lab has a capacity to produce at any one time 100,000 plants, Mr. Speaker, and over 500,000 plants on an annual basis, Mr. Speaker. This is a state-of-the-art facility, Mr. Speaker, once completed, and it will be staffed by our young Dominicans again, Mr. Speaker, who will be trained in the expertise, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I express my gratitude to the People's Republic of China for yet again another gift. Mr. Speaker, we continue with our traditional crops, Mr. Speaker. Our cocoa, our coconut, our coffee, our bananas, our ginger, our turmeric, and all these crops, Mr. Speaker, are crucial to the livelihoods of our farmers, Mr. Speaker, and the ministry will continue to do work in these areas, Mr. Speaker. One of the areas that I'm excited about, Mr. Speaker, and I know a lot of farmers will be as well, Mr. Speaker, during this fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, we'll be constructing, a new citrus and propagation facility, Mr. Speaker, and this facility will be able to produce up to 50,000 seedlings on an annual basis, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in a few weeks, maybe next week, Mr. Speaker, we'll be signing an MOU with the Cuban government, Mr. Speaker, to strengthen our citrus propagation, Mr. Speaker. The team is ready to leave Cuba and should be here shortly. I'd like to express my thanks, Mr. Speaker, to the Republic of Cuba for this gift. Mr. Speaker, we continue to provide support to our banana farmers, Mr. Speaker. And during this fiscal year, we'll see $1 million being placed to support our farmers. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the banana farmers this evening, Mr. Speaker, that your government will continue to facilitate payment of spray chemicals for the management of the black sigatoka, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to provide them with fertilizer, and we'll continue to provide them with the necessary inputs for strengthening of their farms. Mr. Speaker, Dominica boasts of one of the best cocoa beans in the world, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at our wood for tail propagation facility, Mr. Speaker, on an annual basis, we continue to produce over 25,000 cocoa plants, Mr. Speaker. And in the last fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, we established 150 acres of cocoa. Mr. Speaker, with all these investments, you definitely would have an increase in production, Mr. Speaker. And this is why in this budget, we will see $5 million being placed at Dexia, Mr. Speaker. And this is going to play a critical role in protecting the livelihoods and income of our farmers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is timely and critical, Mr. Speaker, and this measure will boost the confidence of our farmers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the aim of this facility is that farmers will be paid in 1 week, as we heard from the Minister of Trade, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, what is key to this facility is that the farmers will now be able to have a sales record, Mr. Speaker, proof of their earnings. And with this, Mr. Speaker, they could go to the financial institution and get a business loan, get a mortgage, get a student loan, Mr. Speaker, or a loan to expand and improve their farms. Mr. Speaker, these are the measures and policies that are empowering and building our nation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased that this facility would be reinstated. The credit facility would be reinstated for the hucksters at Dexia, Mr. Speaker, and this measure will provide excellent support to our farmers. Mr. Speaker, we will be also providing support in the amount of $3.7 million to Farmer Association. Through this initiative, farmer groups will receive technical support, tools, machinery, grant, and other support that they could now provide to their members. Mr. Speaker, through this measure, you might have a small group, one of what we call, Mr. Speaker, cooperative associations, and during this measure, we'll be able to provide direct support to them so that they could better serve their members, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are increasing production, therefore we have to increase our marketing. And this is why in this budget, Mr. Speaker, we will see the establishment of regional depots. Mr. Speaker, this measure will increase the number and the volume of our products that are sold on the regional markets. Mr. Speaker, a lot of our farmers have been asking for land to plant. Mr. Speaker, the reason they're asking for land to plant, Mr. Speaker, is the confidence that they have in this government to expand, Mr. Speaker, or to go into production. I am confident that in the government, Mr. Speaker, that these measures and all the concessions that are already in place will increase the number of farmers as we have seen in the last years. Mr. Speaker, we are providing financial support. We are providing the concession, the technical assistance. We are making the lands available. That is how we are targeting and creating employment opportunities for our young people. We are building a Dominica, Mr. Speaker, where the youth will have an opportunity to be innovative and create streams of income and become independent, Mr. Speaker. Farm Access Road, Mr. Speaker, has been a challenge for several of our farmers, and we were able last fiscal year to spend in excess of $23 million in the repair of feeder roads, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased as the Parliament Rep for West, Mr. Speaker, that work is ongoing on the Mango Gutter Road, and this is a promise that I made to the people of West, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy that I'm able to keep that promise. We also see road improvements, Mr. Speaker, in the Laplain area, in the Makato, Kalibishi, Monrachet, and the Kahome feeder road. Mr. Speaker, what this intervention means, Mr. Speaker, you see an improvement to over 700 farmers. 1,500 acres will now be serviced because of these roads, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the 15 acres that are already under cultivation, it now gives farmers and other persons interested an opportunity to expand or to go into farming, because there's an additional 1,400 acres that are available now because of this intervention. Mr. Speaker, we have made progress on the blue economy, Mr. Speaker. We have plans that are well underway for marine. We are partnering with several persons, Mr. Speaker, for a marine research facility down at Longhouse. We are also on this Friday, Mr. Speaker, we'll be signing an MOU with the People's Republic of China for the development of the blue economy, Mr. Speaker. Our blue economy sector, Mr. Speaker, would have been much further, Mr. Speaker, but due to the COVID-19 restrictions, several of our key partners were unable to make it here, Mr. Speaker, but in the fiscal year, we would see work go on in the blue economy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the budget, Mr. Speaker, we heard the Honorable Prime Minister indicate that value added is critical to the agriculture sector, Mr. Speaker. With all this production, it has to go somewhere. And that is why we will be strengthening our agro producers with $5 million, Mr. Speaker, so that they can procure small machines, better labels, and improve their craft, Mr. Speaker. We would also be assisted with €155,000 through the CDB to design and conduct studies for a national agro-processing facility. We'll also see $100,000 grant to the National Essential Oil, Mr. Speaker, and we heard the amount of bail that is being produced by the Honorable Member for Laplain, Mr. Speaker, and the government is responding accordingly, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I express my thanks to all the agro-producers, Mr. Speaker. They are hard-working people, and we, as a government, as a ministry, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, we have responded to them. Mr. Speaker, I give my full support to the estimates and the measures put in this Honorable House for this fiscal year. It is important for us to remind Dominicans that the opposition will continue to make loud, empty noises, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past 2 years, we have heard them use words like stimulus package, inflation, cushion the economy, relief. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that this Labour Party government has been giving relief to Dominicans for the last 22 years. We have built a cushion for the economy. That is why every disaster, Mr. Speaker, we are able to bounce back and build back better. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that the same UWP, Mr. Speaker, have called Dominicans greedy when they take advantage of the relief measures, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, money saved is money earned. We have been helping Dominicans to save money and earn money. All the financial institutions here on island are liquid, Mr. Speaker, and the relief continues. Mr. Speaker, land worth $10 is sold for $1 a square foot. That is relief, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, housing revolution, repairs to home, construction of new homes and apartments, Mr. Speaker, that is relief. Mr. Speaker, grants to small business owners, Mr. Speaker, that is relief. Cash grants, tools, fertilizer, boats, and engine free of charge to farmers and fisher folk, Mr. Speaker, that is relief. Mr. Speaker, financial assistance to hundreds of students studying overseas, that is relief, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we adjusted the tax rate. We adjusted the tax bracket. We reduced transfer fees, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I submit that is relief, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a significant portion of this year's budget has been allocated to the agriculture and fisheries sector, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind all our farmers, Mr. Speaker, of the multitude of concessions and assistance available for you by this government. Mr. Speaker, we would see further this year that VAT has been removed on tools and potting soil, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, money in the pockets of our farmers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the People's Republic of China, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, the Kingdom of Morocco, the government of Japan, Mr. Speaker, for their continued support to the Ministry of Agriculture and the government of Dominica, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to thank the UNDP, ICA, FAO, WUSC, CADI, for all the support that they have given us in the last fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to express my thanks to my cabinet colleague, Minister Riviere, who joined us this year in the ministry, and I thank him for his support, Mr. Speaker. I would also like to express my thanks to the Permanent Secretary, Dr. Kira Paul, and all the staff within the ministry, Mr. Speaker, the Director, Mr. Ricky Bruman, the Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr. Thomas, and all the officers, Mr. Speaker, for their support during this fiscal year. The farmers of Dominica depend on us, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to support them. Farmers, all farmers and fishers, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank you. You are the backbone of the nation, and your government will continue to invest in the industry for the benefit of the country and you personally. I'd like to thank the hucksters, the supermarkets, and all the stakeholders who ship, consume, or sell produce from our farmers. Farmers and fishers, I urge you to remain vigilant during the hurricane season. Put an effective plan in place to safeguard your lives, your property, and your animals. Mr. Speaker, I make a special plea to the young people to explore the opportunities and plans that this government has put in place for them. There are adversities, Mr. Speaker, but this government has continued to create opportunities, and the young people must take their place in dynamic Dominica. Mr. Speaker, if you would allow me, I would like to touch on the constituency of Wesley. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize.
15 more minutes.
Oh, should be all right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, firstly, I would like to recognize all the men and women under the National Employment Program, Mr. Speaker, and the Yes We Care program in my constituency. Mr. Speaker, allow me to express my profound gratitude to the supervisors and team leaders, Mr. Tom Bazil, Mrs. Anita Deja, Ms. Rosie Parillo, Ms. Casmin Robin, Ms. Verna Tavernier, Ms. Florence Telemack, and Ms. Savina Bazil, Mr. Speaker. I want them to know, Mr. Speaker, I am grateful for the work that they are doing in the constituency. Mr. Speaker, during my preparation for this budget, Mr. Speaker, I took an opportunity to assign a dollar value to the social programs and government assistance that we receive in the constituency, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would just like to look at one heading this evening. Transportation allowance to college students, $21,000. Salaries to the bus driver and maintenance of the school bus, $30,000. Free tuition for 21 college students. 13 students at universities have received tuition and housing. Mr. Speaker, the average cost is $55,000 per student per year. Mr. Speaker, every year, 21 students receive cash grant as they transfer from primary into high school, Mr. Speaker. That is another $10,000. Approximately 250 students at high school and primary school in the constituency. They receive books, uniform, bags, shoes, Mr. Speaker. This is estimated at over $60,000. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for Education, Mr. Speaker, because the Wesley Primary School and the Woodfordale Primary School were one of the first schools to receive devices during the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, we also provided laptops to college students, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, devices are totaling over $300,000. Mr. Speaker, and this is just on education. Mr. Speaker, I have not included. Mr. Speaker, I have not included other interventions from the Housing Revolution, the Rapid Response Agency, Mr. Speaker, and these interventions on an annual basis are in excess of $2 million, Mr. Speaker. On an annual basis, Wesley constituency, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I cannot imagine other large constituencies like Mahu. Mr. Speaker, that is a direct investment in people. We are not talking about roads, we are not talking about buildings, Mr. Speaker. We are talking about people. And we have to continue to express our thanks to the Honorable Prime Minister for his creation of these social programs and interventions for our constituents, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the last fiscal year, we targeted a number of young people to empower them. A lot of young men and young women within the constituency. Mr. Speaker, one of my initiatives, Mr. Speaker, as we call it, building community, building capacity, was created where we provided a number of training opportunities for our young people. Pastry making, electrical wiring, plumbing, and a number of areas, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the help of the Honorable Prime Minister and the Chinese Technical Mission and the staff of the ministry, I launched what we call Block to Farm, Mr. Speaker. Located at the Londonderry, at the back of the playing field, Mr. Speaker, where you saw 10 young men, and last year we incorporated young women, move from the block to the farm. They have learned life skills, Mr. Speaker, which have better equipped them And several of these young men, Mr. Speaker, have now started their own farms because of this intervention, Mr. Speaker. We continue to plant, harvest, and sold, Mr. Speaker, lettuce, string beans, bell peppers, cantaloupe, Mr. Speaker, and this year we begin to see our dragon fruit, Mr. Speaker, and we should be selling before the end of this year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, very often our young people are criticized, but Mr. Speaker, I must applaud the young people, Mr. Speaker, for the positive that they are doing in the Wesley constituency and Woodford Hill, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have seen a number of young people in the last 2 years.
10 more minutes.
A number of young people, Mr. Speaker, become police officers, fire officers. A lot of them have gained employment at the airport, Mr. Speaker, and that is because of the increased flights we have from American Airlines, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the Woodford Hill Propagation Center, we have 4 young propagators, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to express my thanks to these young propagators, Mr. Speaker, because they are critical to the development of the agriculture sector across the country, Mr. Speaker. We have Lenroy Coppell, Tanner James, Leon Joseph, Paul Black, Mr. Speaker, all under the leadership of our foreman from Wesley, Mr. Kel Alexander, Mr. Speaker, as we call him, Doc. Mr. Speaker, we have seen a number of young women, most of them single mothers, have gone into the production of CMOS, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Ministry of Agriculture for assisting them, along with the FAO, Mr. Speaker. Recently, we see a new species of CMOS being cultivated, and this is expected to be much more commercially viable, Mr. Speaker, and I express my thanks to the Fisheries Division for the support that they have provided, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the kind of work that is going on in the Wesley constituency, Mr. Speaker. We have seen a lot of young men move off the streets and put in their energy into positive, Mr. Speaker, and they must be commended for this. Mr. Speaker, the housing revolution was designed to provide support to vulnerable persons, Mr. Speaker. And several young people in the Wesley constituency have benefited from the $10,000 grant, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this is a significant investment for a young couple or a single person starting a home. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to announce that during this fiscal year, we'll see the construction of over 16 resilient homes, 3 and 4 bedrooms, in Woodford Hill, in an area that we call Small Farm, Mr. Speaker. I have seen the designs. I am in discussion with the developer. We'll be meeting with contractors soon, Mr. Speaker, and work will commence on the Woodford Hill housing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are many people in my constituency whom have not been reached by this housing program, Mr. Speaker. And this evening, I would like to make a solemn promise to them that your government will reach you. Mr. Speaker, as we move to the development and construction of the international airport, I plead with my young men of the constituency, the electricians, the plumbers, masons, to sharpen your skills. The Wesley constituency is on a path for transformation, and we certainly want to be and will be part of Dynamic Dominica. Mr. Speaker, I remain close to my farmers. My farmers continue to benefit from the World Bank Restoration Project. They continue to receive fertilizer, tools, and cash grants. Mr. Speaker, several farmers as we speak in the Northeast region, including Wesley, are receiving materials and construction payments, Mr. Speaker, for the improvements of their pens. Mr. Speaker, back then, when you say farming, you say pick up. we often associate farming with a pickup. Mr. Speaker, in the last few years, Mr. Speaker, I have seen a number of my constituents who are involved in farming go to dealerships, Mr. Speaker, and come out with a brand new Nissan, a brand new Toyota, a brand new Mitsubishi pickup, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if farming don't have money, $100,000, where do you get it? As a farmer, Mr. Speaker, to walk into any dealership and walk out with $100,000, Mr. Speaker, it means that you are making money as a farmer. Mr. Speaker, the repair on farm roads continue, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank Renault and Caribbean Construction Limited, Mr. Speaker, for the support they have provided. I would also like to assure the farmers, Mr. Speaker, in my constituency that their feeder roads will be addressed, and most of them are already being addressed in this fiscal year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we often hear about the Londonderry playing field. In the last sitting, or the last house, Mr. Speaker, the former representative, when we received not so sober representation, Mr. Speaker, often mentioned the Londonderry playing field. But Mr. Speaker, the Londonderry playing field continues to be maintained. And we will see improvements, Mr. Speaker, to the Woodford Hill playing field. And I'm working on having that playing field lighted, Mr. Speaker, in this coming season. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the young people of Woodford Hill who continue to manage the Woodie Blazers, Mr. Speaker. Nicola, Sawana, Kerry, Simone, and all the other management team, Mr. Speaker, who continue to work with the football team in Woodford Hill. Mr. Speaker, during the last 2 years, we brought back cricket to the Londonderry playing field. And I would like to thank, Mr. Speaker, another young man, Joel Mingo, who started this initiative, Mr. Speaker. He was supported by Kimani Jeremy, Odiyama, Honore, and a number of young men in the Wesley constituency, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, we see and continue to see...
2 more minutes.
Fine.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Honorable Grant be given 5 more minutes, please.
It has been moved and seconded that the Honorable Grant be given an additional 5 more minutes. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. You are given an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, we have seen over 5 medical doctors emerge from the Wesley constituency. Mr. Speaker, we can also boast recently, Mr. Speaker, we have one of the 2 ENT specialists at the Dominica China Friendship Hospital, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to applaud my classmate, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Warren Alistair. Mr. Speaker, as we speak, we have 3 young persons in Cuba, 2 of whom are specializing, and one of which who is just studying medicine in her 2nd year, Mr. Speaker. And again, I continue to wish the young people of Wesley and Woodford Hill well, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the one university graduate per household continues to bear fruit, Mr. Speaker, and in Wesley constituency, this is no different. I would just like to express my congratulations to Ms. Samika Benjamin, a constituent of Wesley, Mr. Speaker, who emerged as valedictorian at the Grambling University this year. Mr. Speaker, since becoming power rep, Mr. Speaker, a lot of young persons are in pursuit of housing. and my discussions with the Honorable Prime Minister and the Minister for Lands, Mr. Speaker, in this fiscal year, we'll be making 15, to begin, Mr. Speaker, that's just a start, 15 housing lots available to public servants in the Joe Burton area, Mr. Speaker. We'll also be making prime agricultural lands available for lease for young persons interested in farming, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my thanks to the Minister for Tourism, the Permanent Secretary, the Chief Technical Officer for their support, Mr. Speaker. In the Wesley constituency, we have the only white sand beach on the island, Mr. Speaker, the Woodford Hill Beach. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, I commend the team at the Woodford Hill Beach, Mr. Speaker. On a Sunday, the Woodford Hill Beach has a lot of persons, and there's a lot of economic activity happening on the Woodford Hill Beach, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, and this Honorable House, that the Wesley constituency is satisfied with the work of this government. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that they are all excited about the great things that are coming to the Wesley constituency. And I can tell you, this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, that if the polls were called tomorrow, next month, next week, whenever it is called, Mr. Speaker, the URLP, as they are now, Mr. Speaker, they are having a hard time finding a candidate that can beat Fidel Grant and the Dominica Labour Party in Wesley. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the Honorable Prime Minister, Dominicans, and my people that the Wesley constituency will continue growing with Grant. Mr. Speaker, I give my full support to the budgetary estimates for the fiscal year 2022-2023. Thank you.
Yes, Honorable Lugie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. I need the cameras, trust me. I do. Oh, Mr. Speaker, before I get to the meat of my presentation, there's a few responses that I must make. And I heard Agriculture Minister Grant expressing how happy he was to serve his 4,000 farmers and fishermen. But as one who served in the agricultural sector for 31 years, Mr. Grant, are you 31 years? I served for 31 years. I want to tell you, 2 decades, a little over 2 decades ago, we had about 15,000 banana farmers, plus other non-banana farmers. So 4,000 really is not much, it's not anything to shout and dance about. And then I want to tell you also that the greatest gift that could be given to farmers is 2 ships with the capability to carry 2 40-foot reefer containers, so that all the talk we have about production, that farmers will have a market, they will know how to supply these markets. Also, I was very pleased to hear President Savre who highlighted the issue of child abuse.
Member, you
Yes.
cannot use the president nil to support your argument.
Okay, well, it's not anything to, it's
It
just,
doesn't matter whether positive or negative.
okay, all
You
right, but
can-
all right, so I'll leave out the president. But I would like to compliment my colleague, Francisco Joseph, who spoke out on the issue of child abuse and illegal firearms, which is what I was going to say, which I don't see as a problem. And I would encourage my colleagues across the aisle to speak out firmly against child sexual abuse and the question of illegal firearms. I also heard Senator Gregory Rivera singing the praises of the abattoir, and he said how much he loved chicken breasts and how he loved pork. But I have a little news for him. In the auditor's report of June 30th, 2021, here's what the auditor had to say about the National Abattoir. So you could go to page 109.
Which report are you reading?
The auditor's report of